Welcome to the True Crime Storyteller. This video contains audio only. If you want to see images from the true crime stories, check out my Instagram account and tap the follow button to stay tuned. The summer evening of July 22nd, 1991 in Milwaukee seemed like any other until Tracy Edwards, a desperate man with handcuffs on his wrists, ran out of one of the apartments. His eyes radiated fear as he flagged down two police officers and broke into sobs. "He's going to kill me," he muttered. The officers exchanged glances and didn't hesitate. They followed Edwards to the building on North 25th Street, where he claimed he had been held captive by someone named Jeffrey Dahmer. What they would find inside would mark the beginning of one of the most shocking revelations in modern crime history. Upon entering apartment 213, the officers were hit by a smell that turned their stomachs, a heavy, rotting stench that hung throughout the apartment. They had no idea this was the smell of death, a gruesome cocktail of decomposition and nightmares. But as they began a brief search, they saw undeniable evidence of what Edwards had described: photos of dismembered bodies in various stages of decay and deliberate mutilation. The man responsible for these crimes, Jeffrey Dahmer, stood nearby, calm and polite, almost as if he expected their arrival. What followed was the arrest of one of America's most notorious serial killers, a man who not only killed his victims, but dissected their bodies, consumed parts of them, and kept others as grisly souvenirs. But who was Jeffrey Dahmer, and how did he descend into such monstrous acts? Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in West Allis, Wisconsin, as the eldest son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His early years gave little reason to suspect that he would become one of the most infamous serial killers in history. He initially seemed like a relatively normal boy, shy but kind. Yet, there were also signs of growing alienation. His parents' marriage was far from happy. Joyce, a fragile and often ill woman, suffered from mental health issues and struggled to care for her son. Lionel, a chemist, was frequently absent due to work. Jeffrey began retreating further into his own world. At school, he was quiet and unremarkable, but he had an odd fascination with death. As a young teenager, he developed a bizarre interest in dead animals. He collected their carcasses, dissected them, and kept their bones. This was no innocent boyhood curiosity. It was the birth of a dark tendency. Dahmer's early obsession with dead animals could be seen as one of the first signs of what would later become his murderous path. As he grew older, Jeffrey increasingly struggled with his sexual identity. He discovered homosexual desires, something he kept hidden from the outside world. Simultaneously, the boundaries between his sexual fantasies and sadistic urges began to blur. The idea of power, control, and dominance started influencing his desires. These twisted fascinations would later become the catalyst for his murderous acts. Dahmer's descent into darkness began in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. On a warm summer day, he was driving around Bath, Ohio, when he encountered a hitchhiker, a 19-year-old named Stephen Hicks. Dahmer, craving companionship and overwhelmed by a desire for control, offered the young man a ride. They drank some beers together at Dahmer's parents' home, which was vacant at the time. But when Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer overpowered him with sudden, intense aggression. He struck him over the head with a dumbbell and then strangled him. The murder of Hicks was not a moment of temporary madness. It was a gruesome revelation for Dahmer. In his own words, "It was the moment I realized I could kill someone and get away with it." The lust to kill was born, but Dahmer did not stop there. He dismembered Hicks's body, packed the parts into garbage bags, and scattered them in the woods around his house. This would be the beginning of a murderous pattern that would repeat itself years later, but not immediately. Dahmer briefly attended college, but his alcoholism made it difficult for him to focus. He dropped out after just one semester. After a short, failed attempt at serving in the military, He eventually found himself back in Milwaukee, where his murderous impulses would flare up and never die down again. In 1987, Dahmer began killing again, this time with a renewed drive. He murdered his second victim, Stephen Twomey, in a Milwaukee hotel room. Dahmer claimed he could not remember the murder, only that he woke up next to Twomey's lifeless body. The brutal act, possibly born out of rage or frustration, became the starting point for a cold, calculated killing spree. Over the next few years, Dahmer killed with increasing frequency. He developed a methodical pattern. He sought his victims in gay bars, bathhouses, or on the streets. He approached young men, often men of color, offering them money in exchange for photos or sex. Once he lured them back to his apartment, he would drug them with alcohol laced with sleeping pills. What followed was a process of sexual exploitation, murder, and dismemberment. What set Dahmer apart from other serial killers was not just the number of victims or the methodology of his murders, but the gruesome practices he followed after their deaths. After killing his victims, Dahmer would brutally dismember them. But it didn't stop there. He kept their skulls and bones as trophies, in an attempt to preserve their memory. He also consumed parts of their bodies, not out of necessity, but out of a perverse desire to have them with him forever. Cannibalism, for Dahmer, was a way to preserve his victims. He once said, "If I consumed them this way, they would become part of me, forever." These acts of cannibalism and necrophilia were the physical manifestations of his deeply rooted desire for control and possession. But Dahmer's morbid fascinations did not end with the consumption of human flesh. He carried out macabre experiments on his living victims, attempting to break their will and turn them into obedient zombies who could remain with him without resistance. He drilled holes into their skulls, injecting acid or boiling water into their brains in a desperate attempt to place them in a state of permanent submission. It was a failed attempt, and each of his victims died in excruciating pain. Despite his growing confidence and unchecked brutality, Dahmer would ultimately meet his downfall. In July 1991, at the height of his murderous spree, he hit a limit. Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, had agreed to go to Dahmer's apartment, but once inside, he sensed something was wrong. As he looked around, his eyes fell upon a large drum and several chemical bottles, which further fueled his suspicions. Dahmer, as calm as ever, tried to soothe him and offered a drink laced with sedatives. Sensing the danger, Edwards managed to seize a moment of distraction. He escaped and ran into the street, where he encountered two police officers. When the police entered apartment 213, they were met with a scene straight out of a horror movie. The refrigerator was filled with human body parts, and on the floor were photographs of Dahmer's victims in various stages of decomposition. This was the breakthrough that finally brought an end to the years-long hunt for Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was arrested, and his story shocked the world. During his trial, he confessed to the murders, showing little emotion or remorse. He spoke calmly and matter-of-factly about his crimes, as if describing the actions of someone else. It became clear that Dahmer was fully aware of what he had done. Yet he explained that he was unable to control his impulses. He had spent years trying to suppress his horrific desires, but ultimately gave in to what he described as an all-consuming inner force that drove him to kill. His calm, calculated tone during the trial left the public stunned, creating a chilling effect on anyone who heard his confessions. In his 1992 trial, Jeffrey Dahmer pled guilty to 15 murders, though he also pleaded insanity in an attempt to shift the blame for his actions onto his mental health. This was swiftly countered by the prosecution, who argued that, despite the monstrous nature of his crimes, Dahmer was fully aware and capable of understanding his actions. His methodical approach to selecting victims, dismembering their bodies, and keeping trophies pointed to someone in complete control of his deeds. The court rejected his insanity plea and sentenced him to 15 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The trial marked the conclusion of a decade of bloodshed and terror, but there was no closure for the families of Dahmer's victims. Throughout the proceedings, the extent of the devastation he had caused became evident, not just through the deaths of their loved ones, but through the way he had dehumanized them. Family members stood in court, directing their anger and grief at Dahmer, shouting at him as he sat silently, staring at the floor. After his conviction, many questions rose. How could someone who appeared so normal commit such heinous crimes? Was Jeffrey Dahmer truly insane, or was he simply evil incarnate? Psychologists debated his mental state, with some diagnosing him with personality disorders like borderline or schizotypal disorder. Others argued that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions, driven by a psychopathic nature and a sickening hunger for control and power over his victims. Whatever drove his actions, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer provides a chilling insight into the human mind. He was not an impulsive killer acting without forethought. His crimes were planned and methodical, with each victim carefully chosen to fit his twisted fantasies. The line between mental illness and malevolent intent became painfully thin in his case. Although Dahmer was now finally behind bars and society was rid of his horrors, his punishment would prove to be short-lived. On November 28, 1994, just 2 years after his conviction, Dahmer's life came to a violent end. He was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Scarver, also serving a life sentence for murder, harbored a deep resentment toward Dahmer and his gruesome acts. In interviews after the attack, Scarver claimed that Dahmer often made light of his crimes, which eventually provoked him to violence. On that fateful morning, Dahmer, Scarver, and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were assigned to a cleaning detail in the prison. When the guards briefly left them unsupervised, Scarver seized a metal bar and fatally bludgeoned both Dahmer and Anderson. Dahmer died instantly from severe head injuries, and Anderson, who had also been convicted of a brutal murder, succumbed to his wounds shortly after. For many, Dahmer's violent death was a form of justice. Although it wasn't delivered by the courts, Scarver was seen by some as the man who ended a monster that should never have been allowed to live. But for others, especially the families of the victims, Dahmer's death left an emptiness. His demise brought no closure. It couldn't erase the scars of their loss. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes continue to resonate to this day. The image of the blonde, quiet man walking through court without emotion stands in stark contrast to the atrocities he committed behind the closed doors of his apartment. His name has become synonymous with cannibalism, necrophilia, and the unimaginable evil that one person can inflict. His apartment in Milwaukee, where he had taken so many lives, was demolished shortly after his arrest. No one wanted to preserve a place so deeply tainted by evil. It was as if society tried to erase his horrors from collective memory, though that would never truly be possible. But while the physical remnants of Dahmer were destroyed, the psychological and societal impacts lingered. His actions forced law enforcement, psychologists, and society at large to reflect on the nature of evil and crime. Why had it taken so long to catch him? Should the police have done a better job protecting his victims, especially those belonging to vulnerable minorities? The answers to these questions would lead to renewed debates about institutional failures and systemic biases. For the families of the victims, the pain remained unbearable. How could they ever get their sons, brothers, friends back? Many sought to find meaning in their loss, some through activism, others by simply trying to move on with their lives. But the name Dahmer would forever be linked to their trauma. The impact of Jeffrey Dahmer also extended into broader culture. He became a symbol of pure terror, frequently depicted in books, documentaries, and films. His horrific deeds inspired countless true crime enthusiasts, fascinated by the notion that such an apparently ordinary man could commit such abhorrent acts. This cultural fascination with Dahmer raises ethical questions about the way we glorify serial killers, even as we despise them. Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most terrifying and enigmatic serial killers in history. His gruesome acts, murder, dismemberment, cannibalism, and necrophilia have earned him a place in the dark annals of criminal history. He represents the nightmare that evil can hide behind the face of an ordinary man. His story leaves us with more questions than answers. Was he a product of his environment? Were there genetic or psychological factors that drove him to his deeds? Or was he simply a manifestation of the deepest evil that can reside within a person? What we do know for certain is that his murders not only claimed victims among those he killed, but also left lasting scars on society as a whole. The name Jeffrey Dahmer will never be forgotten, not only because of the horrific nature of his crimes, but also because of the fear he represents. That we may never truly know what lurks behind the friendly face of a neighbor, a friend, or a family member. What do you think about this case? Do you have any additions to this story? Let me know in the comments, and I'd really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.